Okay, let's dive right into an explainer of an era where global conflict and domestic chaos became inextricably linked. Welcome. Today, we're taking a journey through one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. We're talking about a time where decisions made thousands of miles away in the jungles of Southeast Asia rippled all the way back to the streets of America, and ultimately straight into the Oval Office itself. So, how exactly did America's longest war lead to its greatest political scandal? What's really fascinating about this question is how each historical event acted like a falling domino. One topples the next, leading right to the White House. We often think of foreign policy and domestic political scandals as two completely separate arenas. But as we'll see in the source material today, a desperate attempt to avoid military defeat actually birthed a culture of paranoia that fundamentally fractured a nation. Here's our roadmap for making sense of it all. We'll start with the escalation in Vietnam, then move on to the shock of the Tet Offensive, the reality of a deeply divided nation, the geopolitics of withdrawal, and finally, Watergate and the long-term legacy. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Escalation in Vietnam. Think about this critical 14-month window. It's wild how sudden leadership changes set the stage for massive military intervention. Initially, the U.S. really only had military advisors in Vietnam, just there to support the South against communist guerrillas. But then, we see these shocking assassinations. South Vietnamese President Diem and then U.S. President Kennedy, killed just 20 days apart. When Lyndon B. Johnson took over and was sworn in, he was eager to commit actual troops. He just needed a legal justification to make it happen. And that brings us to a really crucial point. The massive escalation of this conflict was legally triggered by a government claim that was completely disconnected from reality. In August of 1964, after a minor initial clash, President Johnson claimed that a second attack had occurred against U.S. naval ships. But the historical record shows us that this second attack simply didn't happen. No attacks actually occurred that day. Yet that false claim successfully prompted Congress to pass a resolution, giving the president sweeping legal authority to trigger a full-scale war. With the legal groundwork officially laid, the U.S. unleashed Operation Rolling Thunder. This was a devastatingly intense bombing campaign that hit military bases, infrastructure, and even refugee camps. And this massive air assault was almost immediately followed by boots on the ground, the arrival of the first 3,500 U.S. Marines on the coast of South Vietnam. The ground war was officially on, and early on, those military operations actually led American commanders to believe that victory was just around the corner. Now we move into Section 2, the Tet Offensive, which changes everything. So there was this massive, glaring disconnect between what American commanders were saying and the actual reality on the ground. You had U.S. General Westmoreland publicly telling reporters in 1967 that troop withdrawals were imminent and that victory is in our hands. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong were quietly and methodically smuggling vast quantities of weapons into major cities. They used incredibly stealthy methods like hiding explosives under rice in food baskets or stuffing guns inside fake funeral coffins, burying them near urban centers so they'd be ready to unearth when the time was right. Then came January 20th, 1968. The Viet Cong unleashed an unprecedented, highly coordinated assault during a public holiday. They completely caught the American forces off guard and shattered that illusion of imminent victory. The date marked Tet, the local New Year festival. So, assuming there'd be a pause in the fighting, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were relaxed. Instead, guerrillas struck 100 different targets, all at once. They even blew a hole right through the wall of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, sparking a chaotic 6-hour gun battle inside the compound itself. As the pressure from the Tet Offensive mounted and military losses climbed, American soldiers committed a horrific war crime, one that the military establishment actively tried to hide from the public. In March of 1968, American troops were ordered into the small South Vietnamese village of My Lai and instructed to kill everyone. Between 400 and 500 civilians, including women and children, were murdered. Shockingly, senior commanders initially praised the unit, claiming communist soldiers had been killed, and they covered up the massacre for an entire year until a journalist finally exposed it. The commander who ordered the attack, William Kelly, received a life sentence but was paroled just a few years later in 1975. Let's move to Section 3, a divided nation, to see how this impacted the home front. Back in the States, the draft became a massive target of protests. This was powerfully highlighted by heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. His refusal to fight became a defining cultural moment of the era. He famously stated, "I cannot shoot at these poor people, no matter if you put me in jail."
Ali was stripped of his boxing title for taking that stand. But the constant flow of body bags returning home was horrifying the general public, sparking immense, widespread demonstrations that were mostly led by university students coast to coast.
The nation was just fracturing entirely. On one side, you had students practicing nonviolent resistance, literally placing flowers into the barrels of military bayonets. But on the other side, you had groups like the Hard Hats. These were pro-war construction workers who brutally attacked student demonstrations and journalists in New York City, demanding that the U.S. military stay in Vietnam until victory was achieved. And President Nixon actually publicly praised these workers for their patriotism. Then, when President Nixon decided to expand the war into neighboring Cambodia to dismantle guerrilla hideouts, the domestic anti-war response was met with fatal state violence. This expansion completely contradicted his promises to reduce troop numbers, and furious protests erupted everywhere. At Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970, the situation turned terribly tragic. U.S. soldiers fired directly into a crowd of protesting students, killing 4 and injuring 8. The outrage over these deaths was immense, causing millions of students to strike and practically paralyzing over 200 college campuses nationwide. Okay, Section 4, Geopolitics and Withdrawal. Facing this sheer chaos at home, Nixon desperately sought an exit strategy. And to do it, he pulled off one of the most stunning foreign policy U-turns in U.S. history. He essentially sacrificed allies, like Taiwan, to befriend Communist China and isolate the Soviet Union. Recognizing a growing rift between the Soviets and the Chinese, the U.S. actually used Pakistan for backdoor diplomacy. This led to a super-secret flight to Beijing by Henry Kissinger. The U.S. then shocked the world by shifting UN recognition from Taiwan over to Communist China, which completely paved the way for Nixon's historic, unprecedented meeting with Mao Zedong in 1972. With China somewhat neutralized as a threat in the conflict, the U.S. finally signed a ceasefire in 1973 and withdrew combat troops. But the final act of this war was an incredibly chaotic scramble. Just 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnam overran the South. The U.S. Navy had to execute a frantic evacuation to save hundreds of thousands of desperate allies. There were so many fleeing South Vietnamese refugees that the U.S. military literally had to push millions of dollars worth of perfectly good helicopters off the decks of aircraft carriers straight into the ocean just to make room for more people to land. Which brings us to our final section, Watergate and the legacy. So let's connect the paranoia of this wartime administration to the greatest political collapse in U.S. history. Nixon had won a historic re-election by promising peace, but his obsession with political enemies drove operatives tied to his campaign to break into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate building to install listening devices. When those 5 men were caught, Nixon lied to the American public, paid out millions in hush money, and illegally used the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. Once that massive cover-up was finally exposed, Nixon was forced into an unprecedented resignation to avoid certain impeachment. To really grasp the raw scale of this era, we have to look at the numbers. Consider this. The U.S. dropped over 700,000 bombs on Vietnam and its surrounding countries. The destructive footprint here is almost hard to comprehend. The source material notes that these explosives held a combined power hundreds of times greater than the atomic bombs dropped in World War II, just absolutely decimating jungles, villages, and infrastructure. The conflict also cost the United States heavily, leaving 58,220 American soldiers dead and over 300,000 injured. Economically, the war drained an estimated $150 billion at the time, which is the equivalent of over $800 billion today. That massive human and financial toll deeply scarred the American psyche and fundamentally altered its political landscape forever. But we have to acknowledge that the devastation in Vietnam itself was nearly unimaginable. Estimates state that up to 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers were killed. The scale of this tragedy on the ground meant that roughly 1 in every 10 civilians in Vietnam was either killed or wounded. And the extensive use of chemical weapons, like napalm, left a terrible legacy of suffering that extended far, far beyond the immediate battlefield. So, what is the lasting consequence of all this? America fundamentally changed how it fights. The military redesigned its entire doctrine specifically to avoid the massive public outrage of seeing soldiers returning in body bags. The civilian draft law was completely abolished. Strategic focus shifted away from deploying mass ground troops in open jungles. Instead, troops are now hidden behind strongly fortified concrete bases, there's a heavy reliance on reinforced armored vehicles, and we've seen a massive shift toward the remote drone and missile strikes that define modern combat today. I'm going to leave you with this final thought. By attempting to avoid defeat in Vietnam, Did America permanently change how it wages war? And perhaps more importantly, how much it trusts its own leaders? The dominoes that fell in the jungles of Vietnam didn't just end a presidency, they permanently rewrote the rules of American power. From the battlefield to the ballot box, the echoes of this profound period are still shaping how the public views authority today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.